Namaste. Before we start, a disclaimer. This video is an attempt to explain the journey that led me from agnosticism toward a closer engagement with the Hindu fold. The ideas discussed here are primarily based on traditions that have originated in the Indian subcontinent, and the words deity, Parabramha, and religion are used in that context. With that in mind, let us explore what it means to engage with religion. Religion is one of those things that most people do not really decide for themselves. They either inherit it or they inherit the rejection of it. In some homes, religion is treated as the most natural part of life, like language, food, or family. In others, it is treated as an unnecessary residue of the past, something one must grow out of in order to think clearly. In both cases, the position often arrives before critical examination. One simply finds oneself standing somewhere and then learns the reasons that justify standing there. This seemed insufficient to me. If religion is nothing, then it must be discarded without hesitation. But if it is something, then discarding it without examination would be a serious mistake. The question, therefore, was not whether I liked religion or whether I found it comforting or whether the people around me believed in it. The question was whether I should engage with it at all. After a long time, the most honest answer I could give was that I did not know. The conclusion I arrived at was closest to agnosticism. It was the acceptance of the lack of knowledge. If someone had asked me whether deities existed, the only honest answer was that I did not know. I could neither affirm or deny something that remained outside the limits of what I could claim to know. This was not a doctrine I had chosen to abide by, but the nearest word available for the condition I found myself in. There are things one knows. There are things one knows that he does not know. And then there is this far larger field of things one does not even know enough to ask about. And hence, the question of deities could not be answered merely by pointing to the present boundaries of my knowledge. Because what does it mean to know that something does not exist? In ordinary life, such a statement is often useful. If I say that there is no chair in the room, I can always look around the room and confirm it. But the moment the claim becomes larger than the field of my inspection, the confidence becomes more difficult to justify. I can say that I have not experienced a deity. I can say that I have not seen sufficient evidence to conclude that one exists. But to say that no deity exists anywhere, in any form, within or beyond all categories available to human thought requires a level of knowledge that I do not possess. One may say that this limitation is only temporary, because human knowledge can always grow. And that is true. We can learn more, observe more, reason better, and correct earlier mistakes. But the problem is not that learning stops. The problem is that the unknown is, by definition, outside one's awareness. One can know that one is ignorant in a general sense, but one cannot fully know the contents of one's ignorance. I cannot make an inventory of everything I do not know. I can only encounter a small part of it when something previously unknown becomes known. Until then, it remains outside the field of perception, and hence, a confident disbelief in deities would require me to trust my own limited knowledge more than it deserved. For some time, this seemed like a stable position. There's a certain intellectual cleanliness to accepting the limits of knowledge. It prevents one from making claims that cannot honestly be made, while also preventing one from closing the door on possibilities that have not been exhausted. But life does not operate only on the space of conclusions. Life also demands action. Whether one knows or does not know, one still has to live. One still has to decide what one gives time to, what one ignores, what one loves, what one is disciplined for, and what one considers worthy of surrender. This is where that position became insufficient. Not because it was false, but because it was incomplete. It answered the question of knowledge, but not the question of conduct. It told me that I could not honestly claim to know whether deities existed or not, but it did not tell me what should follow from that lack of knowledge. Should I live as though the question had no consequence at all? Should I live as though the possibility itself was irrelevant? Should I wait for certainty before allowing religion any place in my life? These were no longer questions of knowledge alone. They were questions of conduct. Because whatever answer I gave would shape the way I lived. Every day, one is already making bets. To spend a life pursuing wealth is a bet. To spend a life pursuing pleasure is also a bet. To spend a life avoiding religion, also a bet. The absence of knowledge does not free one from choosing. It only hides the choice under the appearance of neutrality. The question therefore changed. It was no longer a simple question of whether deities existed or not. It became a question of which way should I err. If the truth is inaccessible to the mind in its present condition, then the practical question becomes one of consequence. What is lost if I err from religion? What is lost if I err towards it? In one of my previous videos, I had explored the purpose and power of religion. What mattered to me in that exploration was that the traditions of the Indian subcontinent had treated suffering as something that could be understood at its very root. They did not stop at the immediate causes of pain because the immediate causes never really end. One loss is replaced by another fear, one desire by another, one injury by another, and so on and so forth. The inquiry, therefore, moved towards the deeper structure of suffering itself. If suffering arises from separation and the separation becomes painful because the ego has attached itself to certain desires, then the religious inquiry naturally turns towards the ego itself. The question is no longer how pain can be managed, it is how the identity that gives pain its force can be loosened. The rishis therefore identified the ego itself as the cause that had to be addressed. The individual suffers because the individual misidentifies himself as separate from the whole. The path then is to dissolve that false separation and return to the knowledge that the individual self and the Parabramha are not two separate entities. If this is realized, suffering loses its foundation, its meaning, its power. If the ego dissolves, the desires attached to that ego also loses its former force. The individual no longer acts merely as a small, frightened center of self-preservation, but as a vessel aligned with something more universal. This made religion difficult to dismiss. Even if the metaphysical claims remained beyond what I could claim to know with certainty, the structure of the path could not be ignored. A way of life that reduces suffering. It changes the manner in which suffering is experienced. It changes what one considers important. It changes the relationship between the self and its own desires. And hence, the question was no longer whether religion could be proven to me before I approached it. The question was whether I could afford to remain distant from a path that claimed to address the deepest cause of suffering. And hence, the cost of erring away from religion appeared to be potentially immense. If religion is true, or even if it contains a path that leads to the dissolution of suffering, then rejecting it without sincere examination would mean losing access to something of extraordinary consequence. But the cost of erring towards it seemed far smaller. What would one lose if one stopped treating one's identity as limited to the individual alone? What would one lose if one allowed for the possibility that this consciousness was not separate from the Parabrahma, but an extension of it? In the scale of the bargain, the most utilitarian and selfish path to choose was to err on the side of religion. This is where the Hindu fold became important to me. Within these traditions, religion is not treated merely as a set of beliefs to be accepted from a distance. It is also preserved as a path of discipline, remembrance, offering, love, and surrender. The question is not only what one thinks about the divine, but also how one slowly reshapes oneself in relation to it. Religion becomes something that acts upon conduct, attention, desire, and identity. Yet, there remained a question. If the wiser error was to move towards religion, how was one to move towards it? The path could not remain an idea that I admired from a distance. It had to become something I was allowed or I allowed myself to come closer to. And once religion is approached in that way, the question of the deity's existence begins to change in character itself. Many who have walked this path would claim that when one turns towards the deity with discipline, love, and adoration, the deity begins to show the way. The need to prove the deity's existence to others or even to oneself slowly loses its importance. What remains is the seriousness of the path itself. This does not mean that the question disappears through avoidance. It changes because the position of the seeker changes. Before the movement, the deity can appear as an object of inquiry, something to be proven or disproven from a distance. But within the Hindu fold, the deity is approached through a living relationship. The deity is approached through mantra, form, offering, remembrance, discipline, love, and surrender. And therefore, the question cannot remain the same because the relationship with the deity is no longer the same. Once the deity is approached in a certain way, the question of existence becomes more layered. Something need not be outside the mind in the manner of a physical object for it to exist, is the crucial point here. A thought exists, albeit in the mind, in the form of a thought. A memory exists in the mind. It might not exist in a physical nature outside of the body, but it does exist within the mind. And imagination exists as an imagination. Its mode of existence is different, but it is not nothing. And hence, when the deity is held in the mind with closeness, discipline, and love, the deity has already entered a field of existence that cannot be dismissed and as non-existence. The mantra then gives this existence greater definition. Whether it is spoken out loud or recited silently, it brings the deity into a space of mention. It gives the deity name, form, attributes, actions, capacities, and presence. When the deity is spoken of, the deity is brought into existence in speech. When the deity is thought of, the deity is brought into existence in thought. When the deity is visualized, the deity is brought into existence in form. When the deity is loved, the deity is brought into existence as the receiver of that love. These are the spaces in which devotion actually brings the deity to life. And hence, through mantra, thought, form, remembrance, love, and surrender, the deity comes into existence again and again in the life of one who has turned towards the Hindu fold. This helps understand the earlier bargain a little better. We discussed earlier as to how the reason to err on the side of religion was to help reduce suffering. And where does suffering come from? It arises from the limited identity of the individual. As long as one sees oneself as the individual, the desires attached to that identity continue to carry greater force. Their fulfillment becomes joy, their obstruction becomes suffering, and their loss becomes pain. The movement towards the Parabrahma reduces the suffering because it loosens the hold of that limited identity. If the individual consciousness is understood as an extension of the Parabrahma, then the desire of the individual no longer sits at the center of their existence in the same way. They lose some of their weight. And as that identity becomes less rigid, the suffering attached to it also begins to reduce its relevance. Now, to approach the Parabrahma might become a slightly tedious task given that the Parabrahma is formless and without attributes. And that is where the deity becomes necessary. The deity is simply the Parabrahma with attributes. And that is why, if you are to analyze when you talk of a deity and the attributes of the deity, these attributes are not treated as ordinary attributes. The strength of the deity, the compassion of the deity, the protection of the deity, the beauty of the deity, or any other quality through which the deity is remembered, all carry the force of the Parabrahma in that form and hence are claimed to be of the supreme nature and kind. They're supreme because they are not limited to the personality of a separate individual being. They are the attributes of the Parabrahma as made available through the deity. Drawing close to the deity therefore becomes a way of drawing close to the Parabrahma itself. Through this, the deity is not merely an object of distant speculation, but becomes the form through which the Parabrahma can be remembered, loved, invoked, and surrendered to. The name gives the mind something to hold on to. The form gives devotion a direction. The attributes give the heart something to contemplate, and through this repeated nearness, the rigid boundary of the ego begins to soften. This is what made the Hindu fold increasingly difficult for me to remain distant from. If the problem of suffering is rooted in separation, then the response cannot remain only intellectual. It must also become a way of living, remembering, disciplining desire, and turning the self towards something larger than its own limited identity. The traditions of the Hindu fold had preserved precisely such a path. And so, my movement towards the Hindu fold did not begin with certainty. It began with honesty about uncertainty and then with the recognition that uncertainty does not free one from choosing how to live. If the cost of erring away from religion was the possible loss of a path towards the dissolution of suffering, and if the cost of erring towards it was only the surrender of a rigid and limited identity, then distance from religion no longer appeared intellectually honest. This is why I began to grow closer to the Hindu fold, not because I had first solved the question of the identity from a distance, but because distance itself had become an insufficient place from which to remain. If the deity is the Parabramha made approachable through name, form, and attributes, then the Hindu fold offers not only a metaphysical claim, but a lived path through which the limited self may loosen its own limits. The question was no longer whether I could prove the deity before beginning. The question was whether I was willing to draw nearer to a tradition that had preserved this path with such seriousness and to allow that nearness to shape the way that I lived. That is where my journey from agnosticism towards the Hindu fold truly began.